primary. And as the dust is settling, there's some bad news, but there's also some encouraging news. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who are there to break it all down for you. But for what it's worth, I'm going to give it a stab as well. And we'll look at some of the bright spots as well as some of the dark spots of yesterday's primary right after this.
Press club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and I have to tell you right up front, politics is getting pretty distasteful. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way. The primary election, which doesn't really feel like, it's the big show, which is coming up in November, but nonetheless is a very important one, turned out to be quite a power struggle here in the Gem State. And so to get some breakdown on what happened, I'm first going to turn to a legacy media source, the Idaho Capital Sun, just for their rundown. And the spin is subtle. Of course, you look at the headline here, 15 GOP incumbent legislators lose re-election campaigns. And that sounds, oh my gosh, that's serious. The GOP must be in real trouble. It is, but not in the way that you might think, because many of those GOP incumbent legislators who were unseated were actually unseated by more principled GOP candidates. So let's delve into some of the highs and lows as seen by Idaho Capital Sun. The story starts with 15 incumbent Republican legislators, including, look at this, Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder from Boise, Senator Scott Herndon of Sagal, and Representative Julianne Young of Blackfoot lost their re-election bids on Tuesday. That's according to what was at the time unofficial primary election results released by the states and counties. Now, again, this story was published, I believe, at about 11 o'clock last night. Since then, I believe most of these results have, at least the final results have come in. They still have to be canvassed and certified by the Secretary of State, Phil McGrain. Winder, the story tells us, the highest ranking member of the Idaho Senate, lost to Republican challenger John Kaiser in District 20, Idaho Senate Republican primary election. And with 100% of Ada County precincts reporting, Kaiser secured a 281 vote victory over Winder, according to the Ada County Elections Office. That's pretty close. I mean, it's, 52 to 47%, but you're going to see in a number of these races, it was a very thin margin. So it wasn't like, it was just a runaway slam dunk, landslide. These were very hotly contested races. And we'll talk a little bit about why some of those races may have been so close and so hotly contested. Moving on to some of the other news on the other side of the state, Young, who is the vice chair of the Idaho House State Affairs Committee, lost to Republican challenger Ben Furman of Shelley in District 30, Idaho House Seat B race by the slimmest of margins. Look at this. With 100% of Bingham and Butte County precincts reporting, Furman won by less than 10 votes, according to unofficial results released by the two counties. 3,763 votes for Furman, 3,753 votes for Young. I know this is one of those times where, people tell you, don't ever say that your vote doesn't count, but this is one of those where that's a pretty razor thin, margin of victory. Elsewhere, with 100% of precincts reporting in Bonner and Boundary counties early Wednesday, Scott Herndon was defeated by Republican challenger Jim Woodward, also a Republican from Sagal. Unofficial results released by the Idaho Secretary of State's office showed Woodward winning the primary election by 613 votes shortly before 2 a.m. Mountain Time. 48 to 52%. Again, not exactly a, slam dunk runaway contest, but it's too bad because Senator Herndon actually was one of the more effective fighters for freedom in the Senate. Now, we have to take a look at one more thing here, and that is other incumbents who lost, and this is where it starts to get interesting. Representatives Megan Blanksma from Hammett, Matthew Bundy from Mountain Home, Chanel Dixon from Kimberly, Melissa Durant from Cuna, also Jason Gallagher of Weiser, Linda Wright Hardkin of Twin Falls, Tina Lambert of Caldwell, Gregory Lanting of Twin Falls, Kenny Roten of Nampa, Julie Yamamoto of Caldwell, and Senators Jeff Schroeder and Chris Trakel. Schroeder from Mountain Home, Trakel from Caldwell, all were defeated in their primary elections. And again, there are some freedom fighters in there too. I look at Chris Trakel. Chris was one of those fearless people willing to stand up and speak the truth, even if it was unpopular. But we'll come back to what I guess can only be called the magic that took place in Magic Valley with a number of incumbents that were not able to prevail in their primary race. Oh, there was also a fair amount of controversy over the precinct committee races, and nowhere more so than in North Idaho. Good heavens. I hope Dan Gukin, has someone sitting with him today for the histrionics that he was going into about needing to unseat Brent Regan and anybody else who was on the KRCCC. Anyway, just wow, what a mess that was. But again, the Idaho Capital Sun, and I feel like this is actually a fairly fair representation, says this primary season, hundreds of contested precinct committeeman elections are being staged between competing factions battling for control of the Idaho Republican Party. They're not wrong. A group of traditional establishment Republicans, let's just call them establishment. Traditional softens it, but these are the business as usual, good old boys. These are the ones who are coming off the bench, dragged out of retirement to represent, for the establishment, are trying to take control of the party back from Dorothy Moon, who gained power at the 2022 Idaho Republican State Convention, and from Moon's supporters. Now, the chairmanship of the Idaho Republican Party will go up for a vote again this summer at the Idaho Republican Party's upcoming state convention in June. I believe that Dorothy Moon is actually on pretty firm ground at this point. The attempted heist that people who called themselves Republicans but were perhaps Republicans in name only really didn't seem to work, and it wasn't for lack of effort or throwing a lot of money and a lot of innuendo out there. That to me was probably one of the most disturbing aspects of this primary election was the amount of just shading the truth or just telling outright lies to try to persuade people, we are the real Republicans, we are the true Republicans, where if you really want to see who are the people who are living up to the Republican platform, look at their voting records. It's not like you don't have resources. Idaho Freedom Foundation's Freedom Index, that's a good place to start. The Institute for Legislative Action actually has done a lot of study on this and clearly shown us there are plenty of legislators out there who say, yes, I'm a Main Street Republican or I'm a common sense Republican, but they govern like moderate Democrats, which means they would be indistinguishable from Democrats in any other state. It's pretending, but it's pretending with a political goal, which makes it slightly distasteful, to put it mildly. Now, let's take a look at some of these specific races and things that were taking place. But before we go there, I want you to understand, those who are currently in control of the Republican Party have been called extremists, right-wing extremists, far right. They are dangerous, dangerous people. And boy, there has been no shortage of this kind of commentary on social media. And I thought this was an especially appropriate meme to illustrate what that really is saying. Aren't you a right-wing extremist? Nope. Just a normal dude from 20 years ago. And I think one of the best ways you can tell where is a person coming from is, are they seeking power in order to control other people, or are they running for office to make sure that power isn't being abused and isn't being used in ways that are inconsistent with the proper role of government? Now, I understand that can seem kind of subjective, but again, when you measure it against the Republican Party platform, at least in the case of the GOP, you have a pretty objective standard from which to go. Unfortunately, you have a lot of people who claim that title of Republican and a lot of people who pretended to be Republicans for this primary just for the sake of getting their vote out there. And again, we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So here are some of the summaries from some of the people on Twitter. Lauren, I think, summed it up. Losses, the big losses tonight were Herndon, Gallagher, Trakel, Lambert, and Julianne Young. And she's right. These are freedom fighters, and they've done a very good job in their legislative roles. But the big wins, Racer, Harris, Zido, Beisfinger, also Thompson, Shippey, Marmon, Kaler, Tanner, Bruce, Hostetler, Cole, and Levitt. But the biggest win ever was Josh Kaiser beating Pro Temp Winder. And she has reason to be excited about that. You got to remember, Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder actually was the one who was gunning for Senator Herndon, Senator Brian Lenny, also, was it Heather Scott? Sorry, my mind is slipping me just a little bit here, but there were three senators that were very specifically targeted by a group that is associated with Idaho Governor Brad Little. It's a political action committee, so there's plausible deniability on the part of Governor Little, but the governor did not get his way. And the message that some were saying is, and we're coming for you next in 2 years, old man. So watch out. It was good news to see that Brian Lenny did prevail in his race against Jeff Agenbrod. This was the Senate district in Meridian. And also, let's show you a couple other ones that I think are noteworthy. This one from State Senate District 24 in the Magic Valley. Glenita Zeiderveld prevailed over Alex Caval. Now, this is not a super wide margin, but it's a decisive enough victory, and it's a good thing too. Glenita Zeiderveld has been a very tireless principled legislator. And she's taken a lot of heat for it. I mean, Chuck Winder removed her from one of her committees because she was calling out her chairmanship of a committee because she was calling out the way that the Senate was just rubber stamping, spending bills without actually going through them and determining, doing their due diligence to see, are they really necessary in the first place? And that's what you would expect, right, of someone who you elect to represent you. But, and frankly, Alex, while I'm sure she means well, just, came out with all these smear ads about, Glenita's against law enforcement. She's against safety. And yet it really comes down to, there were bills that were put forth which really stretched the proper limits of government. And so a senator like Glenita Zeiderveld would be correct to vote against those kind of bills. Even if ostensibly you can say, well, that's a vote that, the Fraternal Order of Police supported or whatever. It doesn't matter. If they're wrong, and she did the right thing by voting against it. Now, let's look at a couple of other of those Magic Valley races. This was a huge one. Look at this. Look at the margin here. Josh Cole defeating Linda Wright-Hartgen, 63 to 37%. Look, I'm not telling you that Linda's a bad person. I'm just saying when you look at her record, she can vote right there with the most progressive Democrats in the Idaho legislature, and she's right at home. But she runs as a common sense or Main Street Republican. Well, it looks like more people saw through that facade at this point, and they are showing her the door. That is a good thing. Here's another race that is worth looking at. Chanel Dixon losing to Clint Hostetler. And again, that's a significant margin, almost a 20%, well, the 18%, margin here. But this is for House seat 24A. Here's another one that's worth looking at. Look at this, Gregory Lanting losing to David Levitt. This is for State House seat 25B. And again, Lanting, one of those common sense Main Street caucus kind of Republicans who governs like a Democrat, but wears the mask of, look, I'm a Republican, and therefore, you can trust me to do Republican things. But his actions show otherwise. And this is true of so many other legislators as well. So let's look at a quick summary here. I believe this one's from Dustin Hurst. He says, I have long said and believed two important things about Idaho politics. Number one, the establishment is dead, but doesn't know it yet. By the way, I think he's right. And I think what killed it was the COVID response, which so many of the establishment Republicans jumped aboard and signed on to, thinking that, we have to do what everybody else is doing, but not appealing to principle as to whether it was the right thing to do, to shut down people's businesses, to forbid people from gathering for church, to see people arrested for taking their kids to the park, and all of that nonsense. So people saw through it. The public apparently felt the pain and said, you know what, I can't support that. So the establishment is dead. They just don't know it yet. And I agree with Dustin on this. The 2024 and 2026 elections will allow the grassroots to finally bury the establishment and elite. And he says, after last night, I still believe both to be true. Now, I would add one qualifier to that. That's if people don't get feeling too smug about last night's results and feel like, yep, our work is done. We can just sit back and rest. You got to be vigilant. And this has always been the case. Freedom will not perpetuate itself. There are always 1,000 little things chipping away at its foundations. And if you want to be a citizen who's truly involved in your own governance, you've got to be willing to participate. Now, fortunately, there are lots of resources available to help you with this. One of the most helpful that you will find, and I believe it will be offered again this December and possibly early January before the next legislative session, is by the Idaho Freedom Foundation, which is their Legislature 101 and Legislature, I can't remember what the second class is, 201? 102. Anyway, there's beginning and advanced classes on how to be a citizen activist with your legislators. And it's not about, having the most eye-catching signs or chanting the most catchy chant or disrupting people the most and punishing them for holding the wrong points of view. It's about knowing the process that these bills go through and being able to follow them and to understand them and to communicate effectively with those you elect to represent you. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. They don't charge for it, but it's very much worth your while, and it will definitely take you a long way in terms of helping you be a participant. Now, Brian Lenny also points out the next thing we have to address is ranked choice voting, or rigged choice voting, as some prefer to call it, and open primaries. It's very likely going to be on the ballot this November, and it's going to be sold under the name of, well, in order to be fair, the Republicans have to open their primaries to everybody. Now, you will see that there were a lot of people who faked being Republican in hopes of influencing the Republican primaries so that they could, keep control in the hands of the establishment types. It did not work. And so, while I feel bad for them, they're licking their wounds today. I don't want to see them prevail in November. So I agree with Senator Lenny. Let's bring the heat. By the way, here's an example. This is an attorney from the Boise area. Sisyphus, Idaho, has voted Idaho GOP, hopefully for the last time. In other words, pretending to be a Republican. And a couple of supporters, yep, I held my nose and did the same. Likewise, I need a shower. Theo Wald points out, one of the best parts of having a closed primary in a red state is watching leftists perform the humiliating ritual of registering as Republicans to try to advance their socialist agenda. Okay? They don't care about the ethical considerations. It's the ends justify the means, and that's exactly what you see when you see this kind of gaming of the system. This is activism of the bad sort, and it's not about to go away. It didn't work this time, but I'm sure they're not about to lay down and give up. And this is just an interesting one. I'm going to throw this in there just because obviously there are people in Eastern Oregon who are very tired of the kind of governance they're getting out of Salem, and more appropriately out of the Portland area where the population centers are. The Greater Idaho Movement reports, despite being heavily outspent by Portland opposition, tonight Crook County became the 13th county in Eastern Oregon to vote for Greater Idaho. It's time for the governor and Oregon legislature to listen to the people and begin border talks. Now, I know there are those in Idaho who may not be exactly on board for this as well, but I think if people really want to come here because they value freedom, I'm the kind of person who would say, let's see what we can do to accommodate that. And especially if it's freeing them from the grasp of people who just want to ruthlessly control every aspect of their life through central planning, which, by the way, describes a lot of how Oregon legislators conduct their business. So for the moment, Idaho still holds up a little lamp of hope, a lamp of freedom, if you will, that will bring people here who love freedom. I actually spoke with a very pleasant lady in Twin Falls just a couple of days ago who recently moved here from Washington State. And look, I didn't go into a lot of deep reasons. Well, why exactly did you come here? But it was very clear from our conversation. She came here because this is seen as a place where a person still has more autonomy, more freedom, more ability to make their own choices without undue government coercion. It's not perfect. We still have a long way to go. And part of it has to do with, we have a lot of people pretending to be Republicans or pretending, yes, I'll hold to the Republican platform, and then going off in the weeds, the second that they get elected to office. Hopefully there is a shift now, and especially in the Magic Valley area, it's wonderful to see some of the more obvious cases of Republicans in name only being shown the door, and hopefully we will see their successors, not only prevail in their races come November, but also we'll see them hold to the kind of values that keep us a place that people see as freedom, and a choice state where people who love freedom and love the free market and want to live their lives and pursue their dreams can feel welcome. I have much more hope today than I had earlier this week, just based on how ugly the whole primary situation was getting. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing politics.